What really brought down the Twin Towers, the World Trade Center on 9/11? Was it airplanes, as they've led us to believe, or was it actually a controlled demolition? I think all evidence now points to the fact that it was, in fact, a controlled demolition of the main Twin Towers and Building 7. No one perhaps knows more about this in the world than our next guest. Please welcome San Francisco Bay researcher Richard Gage. He's an AIA member of the American Institute of Architects and a founder and former CEO of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. He now leads the charge for a new World Trade Center investigation, along with his courageous wife, Gail, at the richardgage911.org. And we're thrilled to have Richard here on the show. Great to finally have you here on Redacted. We've talked a lot over the years about the airplanes. We've talked about the autopilot system, all of these pieces of it. But you are really, I think, at the center of all of the evidence that's been compiled to prove that these were controlled demolitions. So, Richard, great to have you on the show.
Thank you, Clayton. Awesome to be here with you. And yes, this material is extremely important for everybody to be aware of. So thank you for bringing it and having the courage for so long to bring this material out in pieces to your audience.
Well, thank you. And yeah, without the help of yourself and others helping us put all of this information together over the years, it used to be a really taboo topic. It used to be, 9/11 truther, you're a conspiracy theorist. And I think overwhelmingly, most Americans believe that something massively fishy happened on that day. They do not believe the official narrative. So I guess maybe I'll just kind of start there. Do you believe that we've maybe turned a corner now with an awakening?
Indeed, we have. And this started, well, it culminated in former Congressman Kurt Weldon speaking up about all aspects of 9/11, calling out the fraud, calling for a new investigation. We have Senator Ron Johnson courageously calling for a new investigation. And he's in the position to do it with subpoena power. So he can take the evidence that we're going to be talking about today in detail and bring it to the American public in the form of a new hearing, a real investigation that the 9/11 Commission did not do. We're very excited about the opportunities of the people that are, because the people are awakening as a result of the COVID scamdemic, as a result of people becoming aware of Gaza, and now the current Middle East problems and all the lies we've been fed.
Well, before we get into the detail, and the way that I wanted to handle today's interview is really almost put all of this evidence in one video, in one interview that people can share. You can share this with everyone, because what we're going to go through today is deep evidence. I mean, we're going to talk molten metal. We're going to talk specifics with these buildings. So just buckle up. But before we get there, before I sort of turn things over to Richard to kind of walk us through all of this evidence, how did you get involved in this?
Well, I was minding my own business. First of all, driving away from the construction observation meeting in Lafayette, California. And I was turned on the radio, listened to Bonnie Faulkner of KPFA's Guns and Butter program. And she was interviewing David Ray Griffin, a researcher who's now written 14 books on this subject of 9/11. And all this evidence that we're going to be talking about today, or much of it, much has come out since he began speaking about this, and right after 9/11, at least 2002. I was shocked to hear this evidence. I had to go back. I had to research. I had to prove him wrong. I mean, I was a flag-waving Reagan Republican. I wanted to go into Afghanistan and Iraq and get those bastards who did this to us. And boy, was I proven wrong. And about 2 months, I did enough research. I said, oh my God, this is a problem. I put together a PowerPoint. I've never done a PowerPoint before. I've never spoken in public before. I've since done 1,000 presentations, right? But I had to take this to the firm that I worked for in Walnut Creek, California. And there, 14 architects and engineers, who most of them thought I was nuts before I showed them this. I bought them pizza, though. I said, look, you guys, free pizza, come in, get it, spend 45 minutes with me, look at this evidence graphically, like we're going to do today, and tell me what you think. By God, at the end of that presentation, all of them raised their hand. You're right. Oh my God. These are controlled demolitions. We've got to have a real investigation. We're talking about all three of the World Trade Center skyscrapers. Many people don't even know. Most architects and engineers don't even know about the third worst failure in modern history, Building 7. We're going to talk about that first.
Just real quick, was at the airport and I was sitting next to two young engineers. They had just started their career and they were both sort of commiserating about just getting started. And they were, structural engineers. And I said, do you guys know about Building 7? And they both looked at me and they were like, oh, no, they didn't know. They only knew about the Twin Towers. I started talking to them about the controlled demolition and you guys should look into it. And they said, yeah. And they said, there's no way. It doesn't make any sense how this building would come down. They couldn't, by the end of this like little brief discussion, they were just like floored by it. And it's amazing. There's just a lack of awareness about Building 7. So I'm excited to get into all of that. So I would say to our audience, hey, buckle up, because I'm going to really kind of turn things over to Richard. I might interject, but I'm going to be watching. So for the next 45 minutes, Richard is going to take us through a deep dive of exactly how this happened. So, I guess without further ado, Richard, I'll just sort of turn it over to you.
Okay. And, Clayton, like you and Tucker, who have put this out to the American people in different forms so far, it takes a lot of courage to look at this information, not because it's difficult to understand. A sixth grader can understand what we're going to be presenting today, but because of the implications of these controlled demolitions. What does that mean? We're going to talk about that after we look at the evidence, but we're talking about the huge mass conspiracy that's enveloped not only all of the media who marched us into war in Afghanistan and Iraq, but the whole world, essentially. I felt very angry upon realizing the truth of this. I felt like a 2x4 hit me over the head when I realized that every member of our Congress, with maybe one exception, bought into this narrative and also the run-up to war, all under false pretenses. I'd been lied to. I got real angry, Clayton, and I don't know if you experienced that, but I just want people to prepare for the worst. If you're new to this material, it's not easy to digest because of the implications. So we start with Building 7 because no one died in that building, according to the narrative anyway, and we have most people don't even know about it. I'm one of 90,000 architects in the American Institute of Architects. We didn't get one bulletin on this, the third worst structural failure in modern history. This building was a huge building, the biggest building in most of our states, as a matter of fact. And it was 47 stories tall and half the height of the Twin Towers. It looks dwarfed here next to the tallest buildings in the world at the time that they were built. This building's about a football field in length away from the North Tower. And it's standing fine here, even after the Twin Towers came down. NIST says, well, it did get hit by some of the beams from the North Tower that were ejected. We'll talk about that. They said that was not a significant factor in the initiation of this collapse. Well, let's look at that collapse. Don't blink, you'll miss it. The east penthouse drops first in an isolated event. And then 6 seconds later, the entire building does this. From top to bottom, straight down, uniformly, symmetrically, into its own footprint. So we have to ask ourselves, have we seen that before? Yeah, we have. But here's how it was explained by Shyam Sunder of the NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked by Congress to explain these collapses to the American people.
What we found was that uncontrolled building fires caused an extraordinary event. The collapse of World Trade Center 7 was primarily due to fire.
Well, that's interesting. Let's look at those fires, shall we? These are the worst fires that we have any photographic or video evidence of in this building. As you can see, they're few, they're small, and they're scattered, and they're out. About an hour before the building came down, these fires are out on floor 12, where NIST's collapse initiation theory began. They're burned out and they've moved way on to the west. And yet NIST shows in their fire simulation that these fires are raging. They imply up to the time of the collapse. But these fires could not have been raging on that floor at that time because the photographs completely betray that claim. So we have to look at fires that's just the beginning of NIST problems, by the way, these fires.
Well, Richard, can I ask you, because I understand there wasn't even enough fuel, like enough papers. It was many of the offices were empty. So there wouldn't have been couches and papers and...
there would have been couches and papers. As a matter of fact, NIST acknowledging. Well, NIST acknowledges two things. One, that this building was only half occupied at the time, to your point, because they only evacuated half the number of people that are capable of being tenants in this building. But they didn't evacuate the building, but Richard Rotans did, who we'll hear from early in a moment. But they also acknowledge that fires only burn about 20 minutes in a given area. They move on looking for fresh new fuel sources to burn up. And that's why the photos show them burning, moving on to the west end of the building. And they were out about at least a half an hour before the building collapsed. They were burned out. And yet NIST claims that those fires were causing thermal expansion of these particular long span beams in that northeast corner of the building, which then pushed this girder off of its seat on this particular column 79 and caused floor 13 then to fall on 12 and 12 and 11 and so on for 9 floors. None of that could be true for a whole variety of reasons that we go into in our extensive webinar in this series, and our film Crime Scene to Courtroom, 9/11 Crime Scene to Courtroom, the docuseries. We produced 3 of these already, and we completely disprove the theories of NIST. Firefighters go into these buildings all the time to put out fires. There's been dozens and dozens and dozens of much hotter, larger, and longer lasting fires in these buildings, which have never brought down a steel frame, fire protected high rise ever in history. Not before 9/11 or since 9/11, where we have these multitude of examples of fully engulfed skyscrapers that don't come down. The only one that did by fire alone is Building 7. So we have to ask ourselves, what does that actually look like? Well, take a look. We're showing known controlled demolitions on the left, Building 7 on the right. Is there any similarity? Yeah, it looks exactly like a controlled demolition, every one of them. And so what are the features of controlled demolition? Well, we'll begin with feature number 1. Is there a sudden onset of destruction? Let's look and see. Here's Dan Rather explaining his view of this building's collapse that evening.
Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself.
Describe that.
Now we go to videotape, the collapse of this building.
It's amazing.
Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the 3rd time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
What was that, Dan? Destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down? Well, here's Dan using his common sense, right? His intuition to understand. We've all seen the old hotels in Las Vegas where they bring them down by explosive controlled demolition. Well, okay. Let's see if feature number 2 is in effect. Is there a straight down symmetrical progression into the building's footprint? Let's look from West Street. Yeah, pretty straight down, pretty symmetrical. How do they accomplish that, Clayton? They have to take out all of the core columns in the building, followed about a second later by the perimeter columns. Any deviation in that pattern, and the building will begin to tip over. That's intuitive, right? This is a science. There's only a handful of companies, controlled demolition companies in the world that can accomplish this. And fire doesn't do this, by the way. These fires, they do not do that at all. If you have any problems in controlled demolition with charges not going off, you get problems like this, where the building begins to roll over. Or this, where the building just stops. It goes down part way and somebody's got to go back into that building and fix those charges, right? So we have to ask ourselves, what happened here? If a building is damaged on one side, it falls to that side. NIST claims the building had begun to be damaged in the northeast corner. We would expect it to then fall to the northeast corner, like this building in Asia, where it's damaged on one side and it falls to that side. So let's go on then and ask ourselves, feature number 4, is there a free fall acceleration? How fast is this building descending? Well, guess what? It's descending as fast as a bowling ball falling out of the sky. This was clocked by physicists, namely David Chandler, for one, who is a physics teacher. He documents very well here that it came down as fast as that bowling ball at free fall. Well, the bowling ball has no resistance under it. This building had 40,000 tons of structural steel supporting it, 3 to 5 times stronger than it needed to be to support this building during its life. And yet not one of those columns gave any resistance to this building's free fall, which happened over a third of its 7-second fall. Free fall. NIST denied this for years. They finally acknowledged it because they were publicly embarrassed by members of AE 9/11 Truth. And guess what? They acknowledge it, but they don't acknowledge the obvious implications of free fall, which means none of those columns on at least 8 or 9 floors gave any resistance whatsoever. Even when a column is buckling, it'll provide 25% of its original strength in resistance. Well, where did these columns go then? What happened to them? We're going to find out. Did these fires, few, small, and scattered, bring all those columns, break them all at once, make them disappear essentially, such that they're, feature number 5, totally dismembered one from another? It fell like a house of cards. This is the pile. It's centered in the center of the footprint. We have a moment-resisting steel frame structure, columns and beams welded together rigidly in the perimeter, and X-braced also, and yet it falls as if they've been dismembered. Here's a group of buildings that fell due to natural causes, in this case, earthquakes. We have the building recognizable as such. It's damaged, certainly, but the columns and beams are not severed one from another. The concrete is not pulverized to a fine powder. Did these fires accomplish that level of damage to Building 7? We go to feature number 7. What could? Well, if there were explosions and explosive demolition, we'd have witnesses that would hear them. NIST says there were no witnesses of explosions at Building 7. Well, here's a few of them. This is Daryl, a medical student, being interviewed on New York radio that evening.
We were watching the building actually because it was on fire. The bottom floors of the building were on fire, and we heard this sound that sounded like a cloud of thunder. Turned around, we were shocked to see that the building was it looked like there was a shock wave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out, and it was horrifying. And then about a second later, the bottom floor caves out, and the building followed after that, and we saw the building crash down all the way to the ground.
A sound of a clap of thunder, a shock wave ripping through the building, windows busting out, and then the building coming down. This is Kevin McPadden, former Air Force medic, and he is doing triage at the building, and he was moved out like the others because they were told the building is going to come down. Here's what he hears before the building comes down.
You heard explosions, like boom. It's like a distinct sound. It's not like when in compression, like boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something. That, to me, I knew that was an explosion. There was no doubt in my mind.
And here is Bill Rosati, who saw something different.
I'm going to call in Bill Rosati. He was here when it all happened. He saw it for himself. Bill, if you can just tell us what you saw, what you heard.
I was standing like 2 blocks away, and all of a sudden I just seen a big flash, and then I seen the building coming down, and I just seen people just running everywhere, chaotic like.
Flashes of light. And this is Barry Jennings of the housing department, who, along with Mayor Giuliani's attorney, Michael Hess, were called to a meeting, an emergency meeting, because planes had hit the towers. And they didn't realize the building had been evacuated because they got there late. And they made their way up to the 23rd floor where the Emergency Operations Center was. And this is their experience trying to get out of the building.
When we got to the 8th floor, I started walking to one side of the building. That side of the building was gone. The first explosion I heard when I was on the stairwell landing, when we made it down to the 6th floor. Then we made it back to the 8th floor. I heard some more explosions.
What's the sound?
Like a boom, like an explosion.
And more than one?
Yes. We started walking down the stairs. We made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion. Blew us back into the 8th floor. When we get outside, a police officer comes to me and says, you have to run. We have more information of bombs, so you have to run.
Explosions like this heard in the late morning of 9/11 in the vicinity of Building 7?
Yeah, here's one of the guys. He can tell you I'm okay, all right? Here, hold on. You want to call your mother or something?
Okay, so not one of those witnesses of explosions, and there are many more, and they appear in our ongoing docuseries 9/11 Crime Scene to Courtroom. We produced the first 3 episodes, and it's ongoing. We got a dozen left to do. What do the experts say? There's 36 structural engineers among the 3,600 architects and engineers signed on to the petition demanding a new investigation, like Kamal Obaid, of the chairman of the Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, who says a localized failure in a steel frame building like World Trade Center 7 cannot cause a catastrophic collapse like a house of cards without a simultaneous and patterned loss of several of its columns at key locations within the building. Does that sound like something that fires can accomplish? No, and that caught the attention of the University of Alaska's Leroy Halsey, professor, chairperson of the civil engineering department, one of the top forensic structural engineers in the country at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks. And he and his team of PhD candidates embark on a 4-year study, a finite element analysis, the analysis that NIST was tasked to do by Congress, but failed significantly. And they produce 2 competing software programs, much more sophisticated than NIST had access to because of the time difference in the software development. And they found that columns 79, 80, and 81, if they did fail, surprise, surprise, they would have fallen over the path of least resistance, the damaged part. Well, interesting. They say to themselves, how do I get this building to fall exactly like the video, like it did in reality? They have to take out all the columns. So that's what you see here, driving the building down to the ground symmetrically, smoothly, suddenly at free fall acceleration. Compare that to NIST's computer model, where they try to release 400 structural steel connections, which is not a natural thing, every second. But still, their computer model begins to bind and buckle and warp like a beer can, crushing, and it begins to tip over to the right. So they stop it after just 2 seconds into its global failure. And so what are their essential findings at the University of Alaska? Fire did not cause the collapse of this building. This came out in 2009. The temperatures were not high enough to cause the weakening of the steel framing. Thermal expansion did not result in a loss of support for the beams and girders. The collapse of this building was a global failure involving what? The near simultaneous failure of all the columns in the building. Not a progressive collapse, as claimed by NIST. So this report has gone out through engineering circles and it's creating quite a stir. And as you can imagine, they've proven that fire didn't bring this building down. So what did? Well, we have to look a little deeper into the evidence. And fortunately, it's provided to us in the form of all of this extreme heat, which FEMA originally reported on in a metallurgical examination in their final building performance assessment team report, an examination of the steel. And what do they find in this Appendix C of their report? May of 2002, never before observed eutectic reactions, intergranular melting, capable of turning a solid steel girder into Swiss cheese, like you see in this piece of World Trade Center 7 steel and this piece of the Twin Towers steel. Well, wait a minute. Fire doesn't melt steel in office fire conditions. What could be doing this? That's the big question here. They don't answer it, but they document further rapid oxidation and sulfidation. Liquid iron, that's molten iron. We're talking 3,000 degrees, Clayton, 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, for which there is no accounting whatsoever in the official narrative, which is why they acknowledge none of this molten material evidence that we're looking at here. And there's a lot more examples. Sulfur formed, they say, during this hot corrosion attack on the steel. Well, where did the sulfur come from? NIST speculates, well, maybe it came from the gypsum board. Well, wait a minute. Gypsum board's been used for 100 years to protect steel from fires. It's never turned around and attacked the steel that it's designed to protect. So the New York Times gets involved in this, and they call this perhaps the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation, but it's ignored by NIST. And so the steel members in the debris pile appear to have been partly evaporated. Says who? Jonathan Barnett, fire protection engineer, the FEMA report author. Wait a minute. Evaporated steel, that takes 4,000 degrees to evaporate steel.
I think like the Man of Steel, you're going to evaporate steel? How is that even possible?
Yep. Well, I'm going to show you how it's possible because we have the evidence of what can evaporate steel right there before our very eyes, provided to us by our great institutions like the U.S. Geological Survey, and in this case, FEMA. I mean, here in this picture of the molten steel or iron pouring out of the material held in the crab claw excavator, we have the evidence of the temperatures we're looking at, because you can tell by the color of molten steel or iron what its temperature is. We're exceeding 2,500 degrees, and with a white hot up to 3,000 degrees. Well, office fires only get to be the extreme worst, half of those temperatures, typically 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The worst case fires, they used computer modeling. They model them at 1,830 degrees when they test materials, assemblies for fire protection, fire resistance in buildings. And this engineering firm says even jet fuel, ME Petroleum says that it burns at 600 degrees Fahrenheit in open air. So nothing in the official narrative can explain any of these multiple examples of extreme temperatures. But thermite can. What is thermite anyway?
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
So we look at the U.S. Geological Survey, who actually did a report on all of the dust samples, thousands of them, that they collected and analyzed. And we have here in 2005, the U.S. Geological Survey documenting what? Billions of previously molten, that's exceeding, again, 3,000 degrees, iron. We haven't used iron in our skyscrapers for 100 years. Microspheres. How in the world do we get those in all of these dust samples? Previously molten iron. So where's the iron coming from? Iron's a byproduct of thermite, as you saw, because thermite explains all of these phenomena that we're seeing here, including microspheres, because when you explosively aerosolize liquids like molten iron, they're going to turn into spheres by surface tension. Even the EPA says that there's so many of these, they're ubiquitous, they're everywhere. We don't know what caused them, but they're used as a signature component. In other words, it's not even World Trade Center dust unless it has all of these previously molten iron microspheres in it that we don't even know where they could have come from. But up to 6% of these samples are just that. We're talking about 4 tons of material by extrapolation in all the World Trade Center dust. Where is that coming from? R.J. Lee Group, an environmental consulting firm internationally, they said, we don't know where they came from, but they're formed during the event, not before by the iron workers putting the building together, not afterward by the iron workers taking the building apart, but during the event. This is a proof of the melting of iron. Again, nothing in the official narrative can do this, but we can find out what can. We already know thermite does. Let's do an experiment. Clayton, experiment is the arbiter of competing hypotheses. Let's do one. Here we're lighting some thermite. What do we see? Thousands of what look like sparks. They cool. They fall into the pan. They're not sparks. They're liquid molten iron microspheres that become previously molten iron microspheres. All of this is evidence of ignited thermite. It can only be that. There's no other possible explanation in the panoply of excuses provided by NIST, and mostly just not looking at it at all. So we have to ask ourselves, is there any evidence of unignited thermite in the World Trade Center dust? Yeah. A team of 8 international scientists led by Niels Harrit in Copenhagen analyzed 7 independently collected samples throughout the World Trade Center, some of them as far away as the Brooklyn Bridge. In addition to the molten iron microspheres, they find these curious red-gray chips, red on one side, gray on the other, indicating that they were applied with a fluid. So they get real curious because unlike primer paint, which these look like, they are attracted by a magnet. So they have a high iron content. Well, they get real curious now. They do X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy on the red layer, and they find aluminum and iron, the ingredients of thermite, in all these red-gray chips in the World Trade Center dust. And then they get real curious. They get out their electron microscope in the lab, and they zoom in 50,000 times, and what do they find? Iron oxide crystals and aluminum platelets at the nano scale, 1,000 times smaller than the diameter of a human hair. This is very high-tech stuff. In fact, it's set in a matrix, a bed of oxygen, silica, and carbon, organic material. Organic material is used in high-energy explosives like TNT, RDX. they expand rapidly and knock things over. That's how explosives work. Whereas incendiaries work by massive heat, burning things up. So they go, whoa, this is a huge problem. Let's find out where this stuff came from. Well, they do a look through the peer-reviewed literature. They find that Lawrence Livermore Lab and Los Alamos Lab did reviews on this before 2001, peer-reviewed studies. They call it super-thermite. Pyrotechnic and explosive composites, they say, based on thermite reactions, whose fuel and oxidizer constituents are intimately mixed on the nanometer size scale. This is what they found in the World Trade Center dust. Also, you see, when they get these down so small, 1,000 times smaller than the diameter of a human hair, the surface volume increases exponentially. So you get an instantaneous chemical reaction. So they appear to have engineered incendiaries to become more explosive, which is very interesting because that's exactly what they do in the peer-reviewed literature from Lawrence Livermore Lab at about 850 degrees Fahrenheit. They ignite and very interestingly, produce a lot of energy, proving that they're exothermic reactions. Well, that's exactly what the independently collected samples did. These produced the same spike of an exothermic reaction at 800 degrees, proving that it's thermitic. Well, this is not paint. Paint doesn't have these exotic properties. And what do you think happened when they ignite? What do they produce? Molten iron microspheres with the same chemical signature as the molten iron microspheres found and produced and analyzed by R.J. Lee and the USGS. So we know exactly where those previously molten iron microspheres came from. They came from these red-gray chips. As if we didn't know, they're found attached to partially ignited red-gray chips, as you see here and here. So this is a very sophisticated process. This is not made in a cave in Afghanistan. This is made only in the most advanced defense contracting laboratories. In fact, they conclude that in their 25-page peer-reviewed paper in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal in 2009, that the red layer is active, unreacted thermitic material incorporating nanotechnology and is a highly energetic pyrotechnic or explosive material. This paper has gone to every member of Congress and every member of the main members of the media, the national media. We have gotten it out everywhere. Every architect and engineer has this. We have done our work over the last 18 years, beginning with architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, because we have the 10 key characteristic features here of controlled demolition with incendiaries. None of these features can be accomplished by fire, or in the case of the Twin Towers, which this extreme heat evidence also applies to directly, let alone all of them. See, all of this evidence has to be explained away, but they don't touch it. They won't touch it. But when they do, they find out that it's true, and they can't afford that for us to look at that possibility and see what really happened here. With additional circumstantial evidence and corroborative testimony, this becomes proof of controlled demolition, a body of proof that's convinced 3,600 architects and engineers to sign on to the petition demanding a new investigation. You can see those architects and engineers at richardgage911.org. You can see them at ae911truth.org, where they are housed. And many of them appear in our forthcoming docuseries that I mentioned, along with Mick Harrison and I. He is the litigation director for the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry. And we've spent 4 years filming and putting out these episodes, 9/11 Crime Scene to Courtroom, an unprecedented film series taking the hard evidence of 9/11 crimes to court, because we packaged, along with the testimony from these first responders, we brought alive the 60 exhibits that have already been provided to the U.S. Attorney in Southern District of Manhattan. This series is essential for getting a real grand jury investigation. We're presenting this in a boardroom to a grand jury, and it will be packaged specifically for them. In fact, it won't just have Building 7 evidence, but the Twin Towers, because we got to ask ourselves a question here, Clayton. If Building 7 was brought down by controlled demolition, and we have just proved that it was, then we have to ask ourselves, is it possible that the Twin Towers were also a form of controlled demolition? And we're going to prove that they were as well right now. I mean, just look at them coming down simultaneously. They were in reality 15 minutes apart, but here you can see the identicality of these collapses. Even though you have asymmetrical plane impacts and fires, the structures themselves were similar, identical, but what we see is upward, outward, arching streamers, a geometry of fireworks, freely flying structural steel sections ejected laterally, clocked by physicists at 80 miles an hour, landing up to 600 feet in every direction, trailed by thick white smoke clouds. Wait a minute. Steel is not flammable in office fire conditions. Why are every one of these steel sections trailing thick white smoke clouds? Well, it turns out that the other byproduct, in addition to molten iron, of thermite is aluminum oxide ash. And in this example of lighted thermite, you see exactly that. The aluminum oxide ash, because thermite's composed of iron oxide and aluminum. The oxygen jumps in the chemical reaction from the iron oxide to the aluminum, producing these thick white smoke clouds from the ends of the beams, which were burned with thermite, obviously. Each one of these is an independent proof. But we're going to look at this and take the Twin Towers step by step, starting with feature number 1. Again, is there a sudden onset of destruction? Well, looking at the North Tower, yes, it's at rest, and all of a sudden, it's suddenly in uniform downward motion. There's no jolt, no hesitation upon impact of the cold, hard steel below. Same thing with the South Tower. It's standing at rest, and all of a sudden, it's in uniform downward motion. And there is no stoppage of the downward motion, no hesitation when it meets that steel below. We're told that the upper part drove the rest of the building down to the ground and then destroyed itself. But look at the lower red line at the point of plane impacts. In the North Tower, do we see the upper part intact and driving the rest of the building down to the ground? No. We see that it's telescoping in on itself. It's being destroyed in the first 3 seconds. It's gone. If it were there driving the rest of the building down to the ground, we would see it on the top. But none of the photos, none of the videos show an upper part driving the rest of the building down to the ground after 3 seconds. It's gone. If it were there, it would have crushed these few remaining core columns standing 800 feet in the air for 6 seconds until they receive an explosion lower down, which shakes the concrete powder off of them, and it descends frame by frame right through. So it wasn't destroyed by an upper part. Let's compare Building 1, the North Tower, to a volcanic eruption in this case. I'll tell you which one is which in a minute. You can hardly tell the difference, though. Again, upward, outward, arching streamers, a geometry of fireworks, freely flying, solid, molten objects, trailed by thick white smoke clouds. That's what molten objects do. Buildings that are falling in gravity don't do that. Yes, the volcanic eruption is on the right, and the North Tower on the left. So we jump to the next feature. Is there patterned explosions and flashes of light that give away what's really going on here at the Twin Towers? Well, the fire commissioner of New York, Thomas von Essen, recorded hundreds of his first responders. And we didn't get this material, these transcripts, until like August of 2005. And when we finally did, we realized that Professor Graham McQueen had locked himself in his den and read every one of them, all 12,000 pages. Well, what did they contain? Why was the city hiding this? They would still be hidden if it weren't for the New York Court State of Appeals that overturned the FOIA request and required the city to give this material to the New York Times, who published it. It's on their website. Let's look at a few of them. We felt the ground shake. You could see the tower sway, and then it just came down. Again and again, you're going to hear this very specific order of events. They're hearing something, they're seeing something, they're feeling something before the towers come down. This evidence cannot be explained away. All of a sudden, the ground just started shaking. Felt like a train running under my feet. The next thing we know, we look up and the tower is collapsing. These are all firefighters, EMTs, fire chiefs. It shook my bones. Shortly before the first tower came down, I remember feeling the ground, heard a terrible noise, and then debris just started flying everywhere. I saw flash, flash, flash at the lower level of the building. You know, like when they demolish a building, saw a number of brief light sources being emitted from inside the building between floors 10 and 15. That's low down, way low down in the building. He saw about 6 of these brief flashes, accompanied by a crackling sound before the tower collapsed. I saw low-level flashes. I saw flash, flash, flash. And then it looked like the building came down, says Stephen Gregory, Assistant Fire Commissioner. An explosion appeared at the top simultaneously from all 4 sides. Material shot out horizontally. And then there seemed to be a momentary delay before you could see the beginning of the collapse. How specific does this fire chief, Frank Crothers, need to be before we get it? There was an explosion in the South Tower, one floor under another. When it hit about the 5th floor, I figured it was a bomb because it looked like a synchronized, deliberate kind of thing. There are 156 of these quotes. I don't have time to read them all to you, but you can see them all on the website. We got to now look at feature number 3. Is there a straight down progression of destruction? Well, at first, the South Tower begins to tip to the left, as you see. In fact, it's tipping at 20 degrees off center. So we have asymmetrical loading on the structure below, asymmetrical damage from the planes, the broken columns, asymmetrical damage from the fires. How in the world then do we get complete symmetrical collapse, just like the firefighters described, all the way down each face of the building, like a belt, one of them says, all the way around the building? It makes no sense. It's a complete non sequitur. Let's zoom in on the leading corner of those explosions in this looped video. What are we looking at? Individual explosions, floor by floor, every 3rd floor. This is not a nuclear weapon going off, has been hypothesized by some. It's not weakening of the steel or turning it to dust like the directed energy weapons enthusiasts like to suggest. These can only be pre-placed explosives in the outside structure of the building. And so we have to ask ourselves, what is happening with these isolated explosives? 20, 40, even 60 stories down below the zone of destruction, which we're told is a gravitational collapse, we have these explosive, isolated ejections occurring at 160 to 200 miles per hour. These are explosive speeds, again, clocked by physicists like David Chandler. We can zoom in to the South Tower and see a dozen of these isolated explosive ejections occurring laterally out of the side of the building and essentially removing the inherent rigidity of this upper structure above the point of plane impacts, such that it doesn't act as a rigid body and rotate off the structure below and fall onto the ground in one piece. It essentially, its structure is turned to sand. And so what can do that? Well, we've already seen what can do that. Now we're seeing the proof of that, one of which is the speed at which this building comes down at near free fall acceleration, almost as fast as a bowling ball falling out of the sky. This is clocked by physicists, in this case, David Chandler, who documents that it's 64% of free fall. That's 2/3 of free fall acceleration. It's gaining speed as it goes down. Each second, it gets faster and faster, the definition of acceleration. It's not even slowing down when it meets this cold, hard steel below. 90% of the structure had to have been removed. In other words, it wasn't crushing that structure. Again, like Building 7, that structure, 90% of it in the case of the Twin Towers, has been removed before the structure starts to move down, thus corroborating the witnesses that heard explosions before the structure began to move down. We're talking about 47 massive core columns, halfway down, 52 inches by 22 inches. We're talking about 240 perimeter columns that you've seen. And what happens to these columns? These structural steel perimeter columns, which are embedded in all the skyscrapers all around the World Trade Center. 3 columns wide, 3 stories high, tied together by spandrel panels, 3 of them, and then erected in place and bolted together. They're thrown 600 feet away, destroying the winter gardens. There are hundreds of these that are ejected that far. You can see the ends of these, how they are bolted together, in this case with 4 bolts at the top and the bottom to each other. So by the way, that's all the plane had to do, was push in these columns. It didn't cut them, as has been theorized by those who suggest that no planes hit these towers. It pushed them in, shearing off these bolts, which you see the holes of here. And so we look at the descent of these hundreds of structural steel sections freely flying out. In fact, looking here, we see the one that's going to hit World Trade Center 7. Wait a minute. Back to, forward to, back to. It's going out. How does gravity work, Clayton? Down. We're talking about something else going on here. Look closely at the thick white smoke clouds trailing this particular one. Again, steel is not flammable in office fire conditions. Why are they trailing thick white smoke clouds? There's enough energy to hurl a 200-pound cannonball 3 miles. And that's a lot of explosive energy. In fact, the canopy of destruction here and the laying on the ground of the structural steel sections is more than 1,200 feet in diameter around each of these towers, equidistant all around. You can see, in fact, Building 7 that's been damaged in its southeast, Building 7, why it would have been damaged in the southeast corner there. So we had a huge question here. If 100,000 tons of steel framing in each tower was distributed, most all of it outside the footprint of the building, how could it also be available to crush the building? It can't. This is 1/3 of the weight of each building in just the structural steel alone. Not available to crush the building, but NIST's calculations and Zdenek-Bazan's calculation used all of that weight to crush the building. Well, maybe it was the concrete, because we're looking for 110 floors, each an acre in size. We're talking about 4 and 8-inch thick concrete poured on metal decking supported by lightweight steel trusses. We're looking for 110 of those. We don't find 50. We don't find 10. We don't find 1 acre size floor at the bottom. We don't find a half acre, a quarter acre, an eighth acre, even a 16th of an acre size floor assembly. What happened to these? Well, we have a theory, but in a real pancaking collapse, like in this case, earthquakes in Mexico, and in this case, in Bangkok, Thailand, in the recent Myanmar earthquake, we had a 33-story building. We see all or most of the pancakes in a real natural collapse. Compare that to the Twin Towers. We have a 4 or 6-story pile of material. Where did the concrete go? Oh, there it is. It's being pulverized in midair. It doesn't even have time to fall and crack up on the ground as it would in a natural collapse. What could have pulverized 90,000 tons of concrete in each of these buildings? We don't have to go much farther than ASTM 6856, the American Society of Testing and Materials, which says that concrete can be powderized at 1,500 degrees. Well, what do you think can happen at 4,000 degrees? White powder decomposed hydration products back to its original gravel, sand, and cement powder. That is new information to those of us in the 9/11 Truth Movement. And so we're not going to shy away from suggesting that thermite, nanothermite in particular, explains all of this evidence. And so we got another important question. If 90,000 tons of concrete is missing from each of these towers at the bottom in the pile and spread 3-inch thick blanket from river to river across 3 square miles of lower Manhattan, how in the world is it capable of crushing the building? If it's pulverized in midair, spread throughout river to river, that's where the weight is. It didn't crush anything. This is another third of the weight of the building together with the steel. That's 2/3 of the weight of this building that's not even there to crush the building. And yet, again, Zdenek Basant of Northwestern University in Chicago, who today provides the key theoretical basis for NIST's column failure theory. He not only used all of that weight, he doubled the mass up above fraudulently, and he decreased the column strength below by a factor of 3. And that's what engineers like Tony Zambodi, Richard Johns, and Gregory Zudolinski finally decoded after 10 years. They found fraud at every turn. So we have 8 key characteristic features and more, 10 altogether, of explosive demolition in the Twin Towers. We've already looked at the extreme heat. We find none of these can be accounted for by fire, let alone all of them, with additional circumstantial evidence and corroboration. We have proof of controlled demolition, a body of proof that's convinced, again, 3,600 architects and engineers to sign on to the petition. And many of them have appeared in our documentaries. 9/11 Explosive Evidence Experts Speak Out, where we have 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, all laying out the evidence. The 15-minute documentary just on Building 7, professionally made for PBS, narrated by actor Ed Asner, and the movie 7 by director Dylan Avery. All of this information is outlined for you. You can go to richardgage911.org and download the brochure for free. Give it to everybody. The truth about 9/11 has to be exposed and distributed. People have to wake up like I did 19 years ago now. And like Tucker has begun to very recently. And Clayton has been on this for quite a while. The truth about 9/11 is a lot darker than just buildings coming down and being exploded. This was used for a mass invasion of the Middle East through Afghanistan and Iraq, where 2 million people have been killed. 7,000 U.S. soldiers, 22 taking their own lives every day. A $6.5 trillion global war on terror that's bankrupted our country. And we're now in a surveillance state where any of us can be arrested without a right to a lawyer, a trial, a jury. We can be tortured and even assassinated. Through the Patriot Act, the Military Commissions Act, the National Defense Authorization Act of 2012. Our phone calls, our emails, our texts are systematically swept up and stored in the largest building in Utah. All completely unconstitutional. But they declared this an emergency. Watch out when they declare emergencies. You got to draw your line in the sand somewhere. Do you wait for the next 9/11? Just put your head in the sand? No. Send Clayton's podcast to every architect and engineer you can find, every media representative, everybody you know, all of your friends. People have to wake up. We're going to get more and more false flag operations like COVID, like Gaza, like we're currently seeing now in the Middle East. That's what we need you to do, is to talk about this.
Hallelujah. Incredible, Richard. Thank you so much for this. Again, the website is right there on the screen, richardgage911.org. People can share this. They can go there, download the brochure, share it with as many people as possible. I wanted to have you on and just let you go so that people could have this encapsulated into one interview where people can share this. So, Richard, thank you so much for joining us today. I think we'll leave it there. I think you put a nice button on it. Any final thoughts?
Yep. I just encourage everybody to support Redacted because they are one of the only large alternative media streams that has the courage to put this out to the American people and stand behind it. So you need to stand behind Clayton and Natalie.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you for shining a light on this incredibly dark subject. It's very difficult for so many people to focus on because, what it portends, mass surveillance state, a permanent war on terrorism, an expansion of the military-industrial complex, assassinations, targets, silencing, canceling, all of it. It's very, very dark, and people don't want to look there. So thank you for your courage in all of this and really leading the way on this, Richard. Thank you.
You're so very welcome, Clayton. Thank you.